I do have issues with it being placed on September 30th because that day was picked and chosen to acknowledge and remember residential school survivors. It was Orange Shirt Day. So previously to that, as a community and as nations, we celebrated Orange Shirt Day to acknowledge the victims and the families and the survivors of residential school. And now it's about truth and reconciliation, the TRC. There is no truth and reconciliation. Reconciliation considers that there's got to be an action, and there's no action. To give a holiday, it's absolutely speechless that like they want reconciliation. Then you know what? All of the lands and the territories that non-native businesses sit on Indigenous territories. Give a portion of those land taxes to Indigenous communities to contribute to their children's education, to their water, to other resources within First Nations communities. That's reconciliation. While everybody in the rest of the world still makes proceeds off of Indigenous lands and territories across Canada.
So this is a great point that you're bringing up is what, from the perspective of our Indigenous populations, can be done better at this point? Where are we? I mean, you've kind of touched down a bit here, but where are we really lacking now in terms of trying to mend, what we can at this point?
Well, I'll draw it a little bit more close and personal here in this conversation between you and I, James. You use the words "our First Nations." Mm-hmm. You give paternalistic view of, as a non-Indigenous person, that there is some form of ownership over Indigenous people. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a start. Stop using an ownership language over Indigenous people. We are unique, diverse, sovereign nations who had abilities to govern ourselves far before the federal government came in and changed that. So I think individually, it starts with us. It starts with our communities locally, creating that awareness and that dialogue and saying like, that's uncomfortable. It is not our First Nations. We are not non-native peoples. We do not belong to Canada. Mm-hmm. We are our own unique people. So to say like, how can we help Indigenous people? Not our Indigenous people, because I am not yours to own. And that's what it gives. It gives a sense of ownership or entitlement. And I don't know if you were aware of that type of language or that use of it.
No, it's, and I mean, this is the conversation that we need to be having, right? It is, I guess on some levels, it might be portrayed as uncomfortable, but it is meant to be positive because it's a learning experience for myself to understand how I'm portraying this matter to you, who is affected, and versus, what I am kind of using in terms of wording. So this is what I wanted to talk about. These are the learning experiences that everyone needs to have. I do appreciate that as well, because it's important for me to know what I am doing that could be portrayed as either offensive or just not, totally ignorant, to be honest. So, and going to connect to the point that this is what you do in your professional life, is you help people understand this cultural divide, this sort of disconnection that we have with the Indigenous population, not and how we can bridge that. Tell me a bit more about this business, Chris.
Well, my business is called RAISE, which is an acronym for Recognize, Include, and Recognize, Assist, Include, Support, and Engage Indigenous People, meaning it's about time that we're invited to the table. We need to be sitting at the table. We need to be invited to these discussions. And I'm of the belief that I don't need to wait for an invitation to sit at a table where the table is sitting on my land and territory. Mm-hmm. I'm going to take a seat, and you're going to listen to my views and my perspectives and how these things have affected myself as an Indigenous woman and as a community member, as I'm not going to say Canadian because I don't view myself as a Canadian. I view myself as an Indigenous person, Ojibwe. And so that, like, but I want to do it in a sort of delicate and sensitive manner because it's a personal discussion. When you talk about residential schools to Indigenous people and you like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, you're triggering their past history, because there's not one Indigenous person that is not affected by residential schools, that they are not a survivor of their grandmother or their great grandfather from residential schools. So it is very intimate, delicate conversation. So that's where I come from when I talk about those things, but it's also about healthy boundaries. So my business is about having those conversations. Raise is about having those conversations, indigenizing minds, places, spaces, one workshop at a time, talking about residential schools, talking about the way of life and knowing as Indigenous people and sharing those knowledges and those stories. From our perspective, decolonizing and like talking about the colonization and the decolonization. So we talk about all of the terrible things that were done to Indigenous people, but we're also going to talk about, okay, so what can we do today? What can we do today is not only as Indigenous people, like my people have suffered a lot as well. And I need, like, my family, my Indigenous people across Canada need to be aware of their history, their language, their culture, just as much as non-Indigenous people are wanting to learn. So again, like I've made reference to this. It's like we're traveling this path in the same direction, parallel together, wanting to learn about ourselves. So just as much as Indigenous people are learning about themselves and non-Indigenous people want to learn, I have to remember, like, we're doing it together, parallel. And that is to make sure that it's done respectfully and in a form of and polite communication. And you're right, like it's about getting uncomfortable. In order to get comfortable, we have to get uncomfortable. And that's what my business is about. I talk about those uncomfortabilities. I ask those hard questions. I address those things. And I just addressed it today with a business who sells Indigenous stuff, and they're non-native owned, actually. And when I had that discussion with them, the business owner took a tone with me and said, I don't think you need to know where I purchased these. Every child matters. And I'm like, that's a cause for Indigenous people. You're a non-Indigenous person. Yes, I do have a right to ask, because that's cultural appropriation. And I think that's what that discussion is like, as an Indigenous person, we have that right to question. And I don't think society is willing and accepting of that yet, because of where the government and our leadership is. If your leadership doesn't accept it and acknowledge it, then why should the people? So different things need to be made aware of and changed on a higher level, so that it can change on the rest of the level of society. But Raise brings all of those things to the forefront and discussing and talking about them. Like next week, I'll be facilitating a workshop on residential schools for the third largest communication and advertising company in the world through a Zoom meeting. And so those are the different types of conversations and workshops that I can do. I do MMIW, I do youth, I do elders, legislations and policies of the Indian Act. So Raise is a multitude of different things in regards to it, Indigenous culture.
Well, and that's why I felt it was important to have these discussions with you, because my intent, my hope is to not only promote a business that's run by yourself, but also something that will start these conversations like we're having today. And hopefully the people can reach out to you and start their own conversations. And to that point, if you want to tell people how they can get a hold of you to have these conversations as well, and utilize your business.
I do have a website. It's called Raise. If you just type in Raise Indigenous, it'll automatically come up on Google. I do have email. It's chiefexecutiveofficer.raise.google or gmail.com. My apologies. But I also wanted to mention, like, I'm doing an incentive today with the local area Parry Sound Chamber of Commerce. And what we've done in Parry Sound as an incentive to bring more cultural inclusivity to Parry Sound is there's an awards gala happening tonight at 5 p.m. and all proceeds towards tickets and stuff like that, or even donations, go towards contributing to inclusivity of culture. So we're going to get a mural, we're going to paint the 4 direction colors on the intersection, just bring more of that cultural identity into the town. It's surrounded by 5 First Nations communities, and for our young generations, like, in order for them to feel a sense that they belong, they need to see those things to be proud of. And currently there is no murals, there's no monuments. There's one monument that is given to Francis Pegmagobble, the sniper, but there's nothing else in Parry Sound. So we're doing an awards gala, and there's donations and stuff like that that can be contributed and made, and tickets and stuff like that. But there's also a collaboration and a partnership with a local author who is going to be releasing her book, and proceeds to purchasing that book will also go towards this incentive that we have to creating more of a cultural awareness within the town of Parry Sound.